Hello everyone, I am very excited to record this video for everyone today for the Simmons virtual showcase. My name is Lilli Throne. I am a senior undergraduate history and political science double major graduating in 2020, and I am presenting on Who Kindly Greet Me Home, Queer and Gendered Spaces in Settlement Houses 1890 to 1930. There are so many thank yous in order for my project, but I wanted to particularly thank the archivists at the Schlesinger Library and at the Social Welfare History Library in Boston and Minneapolis, respectively, for helping me access my sources. I want to thank my friends and my roommates for enduring countless one-sided conversations about research they had absolutely no stake in. And I want to thank my family for enduring the heartache of not being able to present this in person with you all today. And I want to especially thank my wonderful faculty advisor, Laura Prieto. She has been incredibly helpful and supportive through every step of my process, from articulating the questions I sought to answer with me, to providing feedback on my drafts, to fielding so many worries thinly veiled behind me saying, "It's going to be fine," in her office during our meetings. I truly could not have done any of this without her, and as it turns out, it is all fine. So I'm going to do my best to present almost a year's worth of work in a short video for you today. I think it's important to start with some more foundational ideas behind my project. I researched settlement houses, which are an early version of social welfare established in the United States as early as the 1890s. They were a little bit earlier in Britain. They were located primarily in urban settings, especially in working class immigrant communities and neighborhoods. And they offered programming, classes, clubs, and organization space for these working class immigrant folks. Most of the settlement houses in the United States were established by middle class and middle and upper class college educated women. The settlement houses offered social work as a profession in an era where there weren't many other options for women to work in the public sphere. So settlement houses kind of presented the symbiotic relationship for the working class neighbors, which is the term we use for the folks who visited the house and utilized their services. They were the neighbors, and the women who worked and in many cases lived there, who are the residents. I studied two settlement houses in particular, which are on the slide. We have Henry Street Settlement on the right, which was operated and still is operated today in New York City, and Denison House, which was in Boston's South End. Many of the women who established these settlement houses are already accepted into our current narrative of queer history. They had long-term relationships with other women. They lived with them and left behind evidence of tenderness and romance in letters, poetry, etc. One prominent example is Jane Addams, who is not on the slide, but she's probably the most famous. She founded Hull House in Chicago. But other examples include Lillian Wald, who did found Henry Street House, Catherine Coman and Vita Scudder, who were both very instrumental in the founding of Denison House in Boston. There has been much scholarship on the experience of these founders as professionals and particularly as professional women. But to a lesser extent, there has been scholarship on them as queer individuals. But to almost no extent has there been any research on how having queer women such as them in higher positions at these settlement houses could have potentially made room for queer spaces and relationships among working class neighbors. I want to work to fill that gap. And I also wanted to interrogate how, even if the settlements did not necessarily create queer spaces, how they could have created a women-centered space for working class women in an era where none others really existed in the public sphere. This brings me to important notes on both language and methodology. I studied relationships primarily between 1890 and 1930. At this time, the language we now use to describe sexuality didn't exist yet. Indeed, sexuality was not yet an identity or identity category. You didn't identify with your sexual orientation. Same-gender relationships were just things that people did as an instance and an action rather than an innate way of being. That's why I hesitate to label any of these women as lesbians. That's terminology that did not yet exist for them, and they would not have identified that way. I use queer instead because it is, for me, the best umbrella term we have to describe something that they did not have the language for that we now do. So in terms of methodology, I had to read silences in the documents and look into what the documents did not say as much as what they did say. I found it to be, studying queer history, an important technique to read against the grain, as we call it in the history business. I had to analyze not only what the words on the page were saying, but also what they were implying. I knew, because I was studying queer history and queerness in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there would be no quote-unquote smoking gun document for me that explicitly confirmed queer relationships among working class neighbors in settlement houses, or for that case, there was likely not going to be a document that explicitly denied them because people just weren't writing about it. So now for the content of my work, I choose 3 different spaces to look at in particular in my thesis project. Those 3 spaces were clubs and organizations at settlements, settlement summer camps, and settlement drama productions. I chose each of them because in most instances these were spaces designated for a single gender. I'm going to show 2 of my particularly favorite examples with you now, but here on the slide we have some photographs of other examples of a summer camp and a dramatic production that I'm not going to have as much time to delve into today. My first example comes from this recipe card on the slide here for angel pudding. It comes from my first chapter about gendered clubs and organizations more broadly at settlement houses. One club I looked at in particular was the Students' Club at Denison House, and this recipe card comes from the club's annual supper in 1905. The Students' Club was one of the first organizations at Denison House. It was founded in 1900, not a decade after the house opened in 1892, and it was also very popular. There were many neighbors who chose to join the club. It was founded for women only and was open to any woman who attended a class at Denison House. This recipe for angel pudding was a fictitious recipe that the Denison House record keepers chose to preserve in one of the many scrapbooks that I sifted through on microfilm. Angel pudding wasn't so much a dish, but a representation of the feelings that the concoctor of this recipe had about the club. Ingredients consisted of 9 Denison students, not 8, not 10, but 9, and as many pounds of affectionate sugar as you like. First of all, I think that's very adorable, but I think it really shows the tenderness and love that was felt among the Students' Club's members. The recipe card presents an example of reading against the grain in many ways, but here are a few. Affectionate sugar presents a sweetness that the students felt in their relationships with one another. It also demonstrates a tenderness and that kind of feeling towards the annual supper as an event. It was a special occasion for women and women only to celebrate themselves and each other and their accomplishments within the house, whether they be personal or connected to their classes, or even just celebrating the connections they forged with one another. And finally, because it was preserved in the scrapbook, we can conclude that the recipe was a treasured part of Denison's history and represents a warm memory. I also think that the recipe card gives us a great window into the working class perspective that I worked so hard to achieve. I don't know exactly who established the club. Indeed, I would assume that it was the residents rather than the neighbors. But many of these documents were not necessarily created by the founders and those residents, including this recipe card. So I think we really get to see the sweetness that in this angel pudding that the working class neighbors felt was within their club. My next example comes from my chapter on summer camps. In addition to their work in urban spaces, many settlement houses also provided neighbors with the opportunity to leave the city for a period of time at summer camp. One I looked at in particular was called Echo Hill. It was a Henry Street settlement camp located in Yorktown Heights, New York, and it was depicted here in this photograph, captioned "Our Favorite Meeting Place." Echo Hill provided programming primarily for teenage girls. The average age was about 17 of these campers. Of course, the countryside naturally offered more seclusion and privacy than the city, and the campers were away from the stressors of their day-to-day life with their families at home. The photograph captioned "Our Favorite Meeting Place" shows some of the closeness and friendship that I sincerely believe that the camp fostered. It shows a group of about 10 campers, some standing, some sitting on a bench or on a rock wall of some sort, and a few seated or laying on the ground. The photograph is one of seclusion. The subjects look at the photographer, who is situated at a reasonably far distance from them, almost as if they were an intruder. Each of the subjects in the photo is dressed in the same camp uniform as well, with a light-colored shirt and darker shorts or pants, except for the one who stands in the shadows, who wears a darker shirt. I can speculate that perhaps she was a settlement or camp worker or counselor, as she is also approaching the group as if an outsider. One can only imagine what the campers were talking about in their favorite secluded meeting place. But their positions reflect the companionate friendship that I hope that the camp provided, and that I do think that the camp provided. It is not only a photo that depicts privacy and seclusion, but it also depicts comfort with one another and with their surroundings. The closeness at camp at Henry Street's Echo Hill reads similar to me to the closeness within the Denison House Student Club. I can't really say whether or not any of these relationships these working class women had with one another were romantic, but they certainly were close, nurturing, and tender. Ultimately, the camps and clubs were able to provide spaces where working class women were able to nurture, at minimum, comfortable and caring relationships with one another. Essentially, I can conclude that many of the spaces at settlement houses were what I like to call at least queer neutral, and many of the founders and residents may have turned a blind eye to such behavior. I don't know, it's hard to say for sure because, as I mentioned earlier, there was no smoking gun document. All we have is what we have on the pages and what we can deduce out of it. But I can say for sure that settlement houses did provide spaces for working class women to build nurturing and loving friendships and relationships with one another, and that it was pioneering for its time. So thank you so much for listening to me today, and I hope you check out my thesis on Scholar at Simmons within the coming months.